this talk, I want to explore the Catholic reception of Søren Kierkegaard, who was a Protestant thinker from the 19th century, who was also a fierce critic of Christianity. And I want to suggest that he can be seen as an ally to contemporary Catholic theology. And I want to argue that although he's not always recognized as such, Søren Kierkegaard has been an important ally for Catholic thinkers in the early 20th century. Historically, some Catholic readers have been suspicious of Kierkegaard, viewing him as an irrational Protestant, irreconcilably at odds with Catholic thought. Nevertheless, by surveying briefly a few important figures in the Catholic reception and engagement of Kierkegaard's writings across Europe in the early 20th century, one begins to see how Kierkegaard's writings stimulated theological renewal that culminated in the achievement of the Second Vatican Council. In particular, I would like to highlight an unexpected yet important historical relationship between the European Catholic reception of Kierkegaard's writings by looking at important figures like Jean Danielou, Yves Congar, Henri de Lubac, Hans Urs von Balthasar, and Cornelio Fabro, who were more or less associated with the Ressourcement movement leading up to the Second Vatican Council. I would like to begin by making an alteration to the story that's often told about the significance of the Ressourcement movement before the Second Vatican Council. Namely, that before 1962, European Catholicism was in a kind of dark age that was anti-modern and anti-Protestant. But during the early 20th century, there were these so-called rebel theologians who were spending most of their time recovering the patristic and biblical insights that preceded the so-called Dark Age in order to return to the genuine sources of the Catholic faith. By ressourcement, I have in mind the emphasis of returning to the patristic and biblical texts as a resource for the reform and renewal of the Roman Catholic theological worldview, which was first contested during the modernist crisis, but then later endorsed in the decrees of the Second Vatican Council. I have in mind theologians associated with Jean Danielou, Marie-Dominique Chenu, Yves Congar, Edward Schillebeeckx, Henri de Lubac, Karl Rahner, Bernard Lonergan, Hans Urs von Balthasar, Hans Küng, Karl Wojtyła, and Joseph Ratzinger. Believe it or not, these names, some of which you might recognize today, were associated with this rebel group of theologians. In print, establishment theologians singled out Henri de Lubac during this time, referring to his work pejoratively as trafficking in a new theology, rather than the good old-fashioned medieval orthodoxy. As a consequence, some of these rebel theologians were exiled from their teaching positions within their own religious orders. And after the Second World War, and during the Second Vatican Council, there was a change in perspective toward the rebel theologians. And as the story goes, the dawn of a more enlightened form of Catholic theology emerges with the Second Vatican Council. Thus, the views that were previously exiled are brought to center stage as the hallmark of the Catholic faith. Now, from my research into this period and into these thinkers specifically, I found that during this so-called Dark Age, before the Second Vatican Council, there was in fact a larger amount of Catholic engagement with modern Protestant thought than has been previously assumed. In fact, during this so-called anti-modern and anti-ecumenical period, Catholic thinkers were influenced by reading Søren Kierkegaard, for instance. Most philosophers balk at the claim that had Kierkegaard lived longer, he would have become a Roman Catholic. Such wild speculation has become synonymous for what is conventionally understood as the Catholic interpretation of Kierkegaard's work. And yet, during the 20th century, Kierkegaard's critique of the established state church was decisive for some scholars in their conversion to Roman Catholicism. It's well established that although Kierkegaard had studied theology, his experience of Roman Catholicism was quite limited, not to mention his knowledge of St. Thomas Aquinas, or St. Augustine for that matter. However, this did not deter Catholic readers from receiving Kierkegaard's writings as a resource for grasping the broader Catholicity of their own tradition. To be clear, I'm not interested in rehearsing the threadbare debate of whether Kierkegaard himself was actually a Protestant or a Catholic. Instead, I want to highlight the significance and the extent to which Kierkegaard's writings have been disseminated and appropriated by Catholic thinkers. Rather than endorsing an anti-modernist retreat from history as what contaminates purely dogmatic statements, ressourcement theologians embraced history as a theological category. At its root, ressourcement theology shares a basic aim with Kierkegaard's theological vision. This is a quote: "The historical is the occasion for our eternal blessedness, and yet is also the object of faith." Kierkegaard wrote that in his journals. And yet this fundamental conviction led ressourcement theologians to recover not only a more social and culturally inclusive understanding of the reality of the church, but it also led them to recover the patristic practice of spiritual or figural exegesis, derived from Israel's habit of continually reinterpreting its own history and historical documents in light of its present religious experience of God as active in history. In this section, I would like to introduce briefly some of the major figures involved in the Catholic reception of Kierkegaard's writings to see the ways in which Kierkegaard's thought and spirituality have been a resource for Catholic thinkers during the 20th century. For instance, let's consider Jean Danielou, who is a French Jesuit and a theologian and historian who later became a cardinal. The prominent place Kierkegaard receives in Danielou's manifesto that he wrote for ressourcement theology has been overlooked by scholars who study this new theology. In fact, the return to biblical, patristic, and liturgical sources accounts for only the first section of Danielou's clarion call for emancipation from a rationalized theology that treats God like any other object of thought. Alongside a retrieval of patristic sources, Danielou suggests that contemporary philosophical influences must be explored to maintain some contact with contemporary life. What was required to engage with contemporary issues was not merely the patristic world picture as such, but also a critical gesture that could be understood in that contemporary setting. Danielou specifically mentions in his article Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, and Kierkegaard as figures whose imaginations require theological thought to expand to their scale by calling theologians to distinguish between the garment of truth from the truth itself. Danielou says that just because the words of Christ never pass away, this does not persuade us to dispense with changing our ways of expression. Danielou especially highlights Kierkegaard rather than Nietzsche or Dostoevsky as a prominent resource for rehabilitating contemporary Catholic theology. In particular, Danielou mentions Kierkegaard's concept of anxiety as a robust theological account of original sin, which demonstrates a major role that theology still has to play in contemporary discourse. According to Danielou, Kierkegaard becomes a vital resource for resisting a theology that treats God as an object and for affirming the mystery of the personal God hidden in darkness, where no one can penetrate, but who only reveals himself by love. Here we can begin to see Kierkegaard's influence in the work of those ressourcement theologians who, following in Danielou's wake, people like Yves Congar, the French Dominican theologian, and who wrote a remarkable essay entitled The Contemporary Relevance of Kierkegaard. Actualité is the French word that he uses. But Congar acknowledges that the timeliness of his essay is due to the popularity of the so-called Kierkegaard Renaissance in Europe at that time, which was brought forward especially in the writings of Karl Barth, Martin Heidegger, and Karl Jaspers. But Congar in this article marvels at the range of Kierkegaard's ecumenical influence upon various figures like Barth. And more specifically, Congar mentions a Catholic convert like Erich Peterson and a Russian Orthodox theologian like Nikolai Berdyaev. In this essay, Congar argues that Kierkegaard is the precursor of a renewal. And to his credit, Congar does not restrict Kierkegaard's relevance to only Protestantism alone, but also says that for Catholics especially, Kierkegaard cannot be dismissed because he reveals a true gospel, and he offers to Catholics the path of a soulmate. In a prescient manner, Congar discovers in Kierkegaard the resources and language to make the claim that Christianity is not a wish fulfillment or a last resort that allows us to lead our lives on any other principles, but rather it is that unique demand whereby the whole of our lives is oriented. Congar concludes his essay by saying that Kierkegaard merits our attention not because he offers a dogmatic system, but rather because he exhibits an edifying attitude that our times require in order to better understand the present cultural situation in all its complexity. Now, by the time we come to Henri de Lubac, who was also a French Jesuit and later a cardinal, Henri de Lubac writes a very important text in the 1940s entitled The Drama of Atheist Humanism, where he engages much of the available Kierkegaard scholarship at that time in France, which was dependent upon the scholarship in Germany. However, de Lubac's treatment of Kierkegaard in that text shows that he had not only read works by Kierkegaard such as Philosophical Crumbs and the Concluding on Scientific Postscript, but that he was also good friends with the French translator of these works, Paul Petit. Now, Petit took part in the Christian resistance and was killed in prison by the Nazis. And what comes to light is that de Lubac's theology does not represent a departure from Kierkegaard's theological vision, but rather that their writings complement one another in important ways. Indeed, de Lubac is distinctively shaped by Kierkegaard's writings, and by looking closer at the Kierkegaardian aspects of de Lubac's theology, a new insight into the basic aims of ressourcement can be gained. De Lubac is one central ressourcement figure who puts Kierkegaard's writings to work in his fundamental theology and in his theology of grace in a unique way that develops the previous generation of the Kierkegaardian tradition within Catholicism. In particular, Kierkegaard's emphasis on the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist illustrates a compatibility with de Lubac's sacramental theology. Elsewhere, I've suggested that through such a comparative analysis, a new perspective on the Catholic receptivity of Protestant theological concerns before the Second Vatican Council is illuminated through this process. Rather than construing the ressourcement theology as a purely patristic enterprise, de Lubac's engagement with Kierkegaard shows how the scope of ressourcement can be extended to include engagement with modern thought. In the winter term of 1926 to 1927, long before his personal friendship with Karl Barth began, the Swiss theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar was first introduced to Kierkegaard's writings by Romano Guardini in Berlin. In his writings, Balthasar occasionally praises Kierkegaard. Indeed, in one of his earliest books, entitled The Christian and Anxiety, was generated out of his engagement with one of Kierkegaard's most significant works. However, Balthasar later reflects upon this encounter as my misfortune. Elsewhere, I've reevaluated Balthasar's critique of Kierkegaard's view of anxiety and aesthetics. And my argument is that there is a particular Christological problem in Balthasar's thematization of distance in his theology of anxiety and aesthetics, which could be better addressed if Balthasar had actually attended to Kierkegaard's dialectical view of anxiety and aesthetics. Alternatively, I suggest that instead of using Kierkegaard as a Protestant foil, Kierkegaard's Christology works as a corrective to Balthasar's theological project. Moreover, readers of Balthasar and Kierkegaard should find that they share more compatible goals than is commonly recognized. Finally, I want to look at the Italian Thomist Cornelio Fabro, who was an important philosopher in the 20th century and a peritus at the Second Vatican Council. He's the final figure that I wish to mention. Elsewhere, I've surveyed the constructive theological features of his underexplored writings to set the stage of Fabro's historical context and suggest that his loyalty to the Thomist revival after Aeterni Patris should not be interpreted as mutually exclusive with his desire to negotiate the claims of the modern world. In fact, Fabro's recovery of Kierkegaard's writings indicates Fabro's wider project of renewal in Catholic theology in the modern age. Specifically, Fabreau's treatment of Kierkegaard's Mariology and his ecclesiology indicates two counterintuitive examples of Catholic theological renewal. Fabreau draws heavily upon Kierkegaard's account of freedom and attempts to provide concrete examples of Kierkegaard's high regard for Mary and his critique of Christendom in ways that parallel John Henry Newman. And he makes Kierkegaard more palatable to Catholic readers. To gain a better sense of Fabreau's lifelong engagement with Kierkegaard, one must appreciate how Fabreau actually learned Danish in order to translate Kierkegaard's writings and journals into Italian. And he did this in order to overturn a common perception of Kierkegaard as merely a precursor to atheistic existentialism. As a Thomistic philosopher, Fabreau is sensitive to the Platonic and Aristotelian resonances in Kierkegaard's writings. By briefly highlighting the ways that Danelou, Congar, de Lubac, Balthazar, and Cornelio Fabreau engaged with Kierkegaard's writings, my aim has been not merely to sketch an outline of Catholic engagement with Kierkegaard, but rather to provide a range of representative entry points for Kierkegaard's writings to continue to stimulate reform and renewal in Catholic theology today, in the shadow and spirit of the Ressourcement movement. In other words, Ressourcement theologians working in a post-Tridentine context gravitated toward Kierkegaard because his writings offered a critique of a form of Christianity that Stephen Mulhall has described as having a form of amnesia about its own concepts, a failure to remember and enact the true significance of the Christian form of life. For these Catholic thinkers, Kierkegaard's writings became attractive, not least since they deployed a curative strategy, presenting reminders of a grammar of those concepts through narratives of lives in which they are either embodied or tellingly absent, that in turn supplied Ressourcement theologians with a crucial strategy for their own project in modernity. In particular, Kierkegaard's theological anthropology was a welcome resource for Ressourcement theologians writing in an era when philosophy cannot say sin. Yet these theologians and Kierkegaard shared the common ground of recovering a scriptural and theological heritage that assigns human subjectivity a vital role to play in living out the faith. In this light, then, some important Catholic thinkers saw Kierkegaard as a fellow pilgrim in the modern age who is engaged in a similar task of ressourcement.